Now it's okay. So welcome back to the last part of the final conference of the project Transform, the final part of day one. Of course, we have a further day until lunchtime tomorrow to discuss about the present and the future of Transform together with other speakers to present initiatives across Europe about citizen engagement and stakeholder engagement in key European territorial policies. So we will have a lot of interesting things also tomorrow. But today we have other two interesting sessions to listen to, and the first one is about our colleagues from the Museum of Science in Boston that will share their experience on CC-PES and citizen engagement activities led by the Museum of Science, as we have presented today in the first part of the final conference. We have paired with them to implement a mutual learning process between our activities in the three regions in Transform and their activities across the United States. David Sittenfeld, who is the leader of the activity of CC-PES, is online now, is in Boston, so unfortunately was not possible to have David and all his colleagues from the museum together with us, but we can listen to him right now. So welcome, David, the stage is yours.
Thanks so much. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, great. Hello, thank you for allowing us to participate virtually from the US. Yeah, the timing was just quite challenging for us, so we couldn't make it in person. I wish we could be there. It looks like an amazing venue. My name's David Sittenfeld, and I'm joining from Boston. And you'll hear a little bit later from my fantastic colleague, Max Colley, at the Museum of Life and Science in Durham, North Carolina. And I see that some of our other project partners are on the call as well, which is great because you have the actual brains of the operation in addition to me. And I want to thank Max for squeezing this presentation into a very challenging window of time on short notice. Thank you, Max, for doing that. Max and I are going to talk about our work on a project that was funded by the National Science Foundation here in the United States that, as Angela has said, is very similar to Transform in a number of important ways. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Hopefully it will work. Let's see. Are you able to see the right view? Well, I'm not hearing anything. I hope that's a yes.
Yes, we can hear you,
okay,
David.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Since the timing of the project was actually also quite similar to Transform, we experienced a lot of the same challenges and travails that you've been hearing about as the pandemic progressed. And we're going to talk about what we did, a little bit about what we learned, and I'll try to also include mentions along the way where I can of how we've learned from the important work that Transform has been doing as our project kind of happened in parallel. And if time permits, I'm also going to try to squeeze some time in to talk a little bit about how both Max's institution and ours have also applied this co-creation process to the realm of citizen science, because as you've all been hearing, this is a big part of the Transform project, and we heard a great example of a keynote as well this morning. So yes, I really have been watching since 5 a.m. our time, and I've enjoyed all of the presentations. So I don't think I have to go into too much theory here for you all, because I've been learning a great deal from you, but just a note on nomenclature. In the informal science education world, we tend to talk about public engagement with science, or PES, rather than RRI. But it's really a lot of the same ideas. And on our website, publicengagementwithscience.org, that you can see there, you can see a definition that we have of public engagement. And in the second paragraph that you can see in the words there, we go beyond the sort of typical nomenclature of just facilitating mutual learning between community members and scientific institutions to this idea that everyday community members really have the power to inform the framing and selection of the problems that should be addressed. And that's really what this project is all about. Also, if you look carefully, Max is in this picture. So the CC-PES project applies these co-creation ideas to what we call forum programs. And these are deliberative experiences that allow people to share perspectives with one another about issues that are at the intersection of science and society. And I think you all know all about that. So I'm not going to go too much in detail about it, but I am going to say that we tend to focus our work on socio-scientific questions, the questions that cannot be answered by science alone, but rather require personal experience, social values, and scientific evidence for deliberation. And the core elements of these forums, no matter what the format are sort of a few elements: shared background information so that everyone feels like they've got the information they need to participate and they can bring their values and their personal experience, which they're experts in, to the conversation. An explicit recognition that participants and lay publics have important and valuable knowledge to share, collaborative co-development of knowledge about these carefully sort of formed socio-scientific questions. You'll hear a lot about that from me and Max in a moment. And then reporting out and dissemination of what the participants create so that other people are in a position to hear what happens. And so what we really did here was try to take that forum model and bring forward much of the co-creation principles that you've all been talking about all day. And so very quickly, I'm just going to overview sort of the phases and components of the project. And I think you'll see some really clear connections to the work that you've all been talking about today in Transform. The first phase of our model is what we call the agenda setting or topic selection phase. And that's where science center educators at the museums that we've had in our project, and you'll see those in a couple of minutes, work with civic and community partners to develop, evaluate, and revise one of these socio-scientific questions. And then the teams work to revise the materials that they create, recruit public participants, and hold the events to get information. And we call this the decision-making phase. And then in the final phase, which we call the policy forming stage or the action stage, the teams take the information that they heard from the public during the forums and bring them for others to hear and learn from. And this work is kind of informed by a number of pieces in the science communication literature. And I just want to call one forward. It's a foundational paper that many of you probably know from Rowe and Frewer in Science, Technology, and Human Values. And it sort of identifies the flow of information in public participation processes as bidirectional, unlike something where the government just tells people what they should hear, or where the government just listens to people but doesn't have a chance to respond. This paper talked a little bit about the idea of bidirectional opportunities for both groups to learn from each other. And they specifically said that the public should be engaged in 3 areas of the public policymaking process that they name on the right: the agenda setting, decision-making, and policy forming phases. But they didn't define them. And so we said, maybe this is our opportunity to think a little bit about what this could look like for co-created public engagement in the informal science education arena. And that's where we came forward with this model for co-creation that we tested and put into play during this project. So again, this is another way of talking about what we said. There are 3 elements, at least, to the partnerships that are formed through these co-created activities: civic organizations representing government, community organizations representing non-governmental institutions. You'll hear a little bit about the variety that participated in our work, and an informal science education institution, a science museum or outreach center. In this case, they were all science museums. And so during the agenda setting and topic selection, the teams come together with members of the community and decide what socio-scientific topics should be addressed. In the decision-making phase, the teams hold a forum to discuss their topic, to collect opinions from participants, and to generate recommendations based on their audience's ideas. And then lastly, in this policy forming or action phase, there's the discussion of the outcomes, and people formulate action plans and disseminate their findings. And we actually broke these down into discrete steps. So I'm not going to go through them in too much detail, but we sort of put together everything that's going to happen during these phases to try to learn from them. And so here's the agenda setting phase. Here is the decision-making phase, and here is the action phase. And you're going to see examples of these as we progress through discussions of what happened in our locations. And so the places where this took place, we had sort of a parallel group of clusters to the ones that you've been hearing about in Transform. We had 4 locations that facilitated partnerships, and 3 of them went forward and have done this co-creation from the beginning to the end. And we're going to focus largely on the work in Boston and North Carolina because that's where Max and I are based. But the evaluation results that we'll discuss will also reflect the terrific work that was done in Portland, Oregon. And if I have time, I'll mention that quickly. So very quickly, this is what the model looked like for our team in Boston. Our partners had the Urban College of Boston, which serves predominantly non-traditional students, a lot of working parents, populations who are non-white, and many of them are taking their coursework in a language beyond English and learning English at the same time as they are doing this coursework pretty far into their life and their career. And we worked with the Mayor's Office of New Urban Mechanics in the city government. That's an office that works across departments and takes on issues that kind of go across traditional policy spheres. And so the audience were these students at the Urban College of Boston that represent demographics that are quite different from the ones who typically self-select to our events at the museum. And so we held one of these welcome events and topic selection workshop to land on the issues that we considered, which you can see in the middle: housing, economy, and education. Those are topics that came from the students and are things that the Museum of Science had never taken on before. So it was a big learning sort of opportunity and a change for us in scope. And the team designed a forum called Thinking Outside the Blocks to look at the development of a hypothetical open lot in Boston after the topic of housing was selected. And then we were ready to present this forum in person on March 24th, 2020, when the pandemic hit. So there was a big pivot and everything had to be done virtually. And so a quick look at what that looked like. Here you can see the welcome event on the top. We did data collection to hear from the students what kind of things were on their mind and what they would like to see. In the middle, you can see the topic selection workshop where the participants considered the various topics and ultimately landed on housing. We did a number of formative focus groups and then developed the forum materials, which were ready to be done in person, but then we pivoted to an online event and a policy forming event that was online focused on this topic of housing. And I would say what we learned from this was that the overarching framework made a lot of sense, but the policy forming event both was difficult to figure out how to have it go directly from the forum, and also there were a lot of confounding influences from the pandemic that we'll talk about a little bit later. Very quickly, I want to mention the work that was done in Portland, Oregon. It was a very different group. The partnership consisted of the museum, Oregon Museum of Science and Industry, the Metro Regional Government, which is a group across the Portland, Oregon area that works on issues related to land use, infrastructure, and nature, and a youth group called Momentum Alliance that works on environmental justice and helps youth become social justice advocates and leaders. And they ended up landing on this question of climate change and corporate responsibility, and youth helped to inform how that all worked. They were youth groups at all 3 locations that did the co-creation. We can talk more about that afterwards, but now I'm going to turn the presentation over to my colleague Max, who's going to talk about the excellent work that they have been doing in Durham, North Carolina.
Thank you, David, and thanks to all of you out there. It's a pleasure to be joining you from here in Durham, North Carolina. I'll talk a little bit about our process, which was a bit opposite of the process that David described, in that most of our formative processes occurred during sort of the depths of the pandemic, but then we were actually able to host our forum event in person very recently. Our process was quite different, as you see here on the chart. I work at the Museum of Life and Science, which is a 75-year-old science center in Durham. And we paired with an existing partner that we've worked with for about a decade, which is Families Moving Forward. Families Moving Forward is Durham's largest homeless shelter, and it also is the only homeless shelter in Durham that serves families experiencing homelessness temporarily. Some of the pieces of context for that is that Families Moving Forward tend to work with families over the course of no more than about 6 months. And we really wanted to look at the families there not as our audience, co-creators and collaborators. Given that, however, the initial phases of our project were really characterized with trying to figure out how a partnership, how a co-creation between such different organizations might work. And a lot of that had to do with sharing decision-making and sharing power. Given that there is a huge amount of distrust among families who are currently experiencing homelessness of civic institutions, we didn't feel like it was tremendously appropriate to prescribe a civic partner from the beginning, and instead let some of our topic selection help us to select a civic partner that we all felt like we could trust. So before bringing on a civic partner, Families Moving Forward and the museum hosted these first 2 phases of our project to understand what topics were of interest to families currently living in shelter. As David kind of mentioned before, this is not coming into one of these without a prescribed topic is not, it's a bit of a risky proposition, right? In that we had very little control over what families would actually say was of interest to them. Some of what they mentioned in some of our initial forum settings were things like urban green spaces, which we have some experience with, things like education reform, which we also had some experience with. But for topics like public safety and affordable housing, these were not topics that I personally am expert in, nor did the museum really have any experience in doing programming around them. It was also really important for us to tie really directly our understanding of what we meant when we talked about science or socio-scientific topics and how these issues are directly tied to science in that they are currently relevant topics that are informed by evidence. Eventually, the process made it so that families selected affordable housing as the topic that was most interesting to them. And from there, we were able to bring in Durham's Neighborhood Improvement Services, or NIS, to work as our third partner on this. It's a service that works with a lot of residents and serves as an education arm and engagement arm of the city towards working with residents and understanding issues like this. Affordable housing was far too large of a topic for us to begin immediately developing a forum around. And so we worked again with families, and as this project progressed over the course of around 2 years, the families themselves turned over as families joyfully moved into housing. We were able to hold on to some of those families and continually engage with them even after they were in housing through FMF's engagement program, but we also worked with lots of new families moving into the shelter as well. We hosted a number of listening sessions to better understand what residents within the shelter actually meant when they used the term affordable housing in order to develop out 4 different modules for our public forum that really centered the expertise and lived experience of the families there. What we came to understand is that we really wanted to center those 2 pieces, the expertise and lived experiences of the folks staying within the shelter, and that there was a real priority for them that we wanted to take on via this power sharing agreement that we had created to help to demystify some of the experience of homelessness with an end goal of helping to end some of the stigma around the experience of homelessness. We also felt like it was really important and a big priority from the families to broaden their expertise and their lived experiences and give that to people that did not have that yet. Affordable housing is indeed one of the really big hot topic issues in Durham. Our metro area is one of the fastest growing in the United States, and so it is an incredibly relevant policy topic. However, it's not an easy one for people to initially engage with. And we wanted to make sure that we provided a space for people who perhaps have not experienced homelessness themselves or have not experienced some of the challenges that slide people into homelessness before, an opportunity to learn about it from these lived experiences from the families there. The forum was developed based off of 4 different modules that families had told us about and occurred at a public library, at the museum, and at a heritage center. We can go through a few of these photos here. That's the forum at the library. You can go to the next slide. This one is at a heritage center. You can see some of the housing activities there. You can go to the next one. This is a ranking activity around lease agreements. You can go to the next slide. This one is a ranking and selection activity around housing applications. You can go to the next slide. Another one here at the Museum of Life and Science around finding a place to live that works for you and your family. You can go to the next one. We are also working on hosting one that occurs entirely in Spanish. We attempted to do a bilingual one, and we decided that it would work better with our partners to host one that occurs entirely in Spanish. You can go to the next one. More excellent photos of one of our forums there at the museum. You can go to the next slide. And this is kind of part of the sentiment that we were hoping to get across, is providing people with an opportunity to take on an emotionally and intellectually challenging topic, perhaps for the first time, and make some of the decisions that people are actually making in their day-to-day lives. I'll pause there and hand it back over to my colleague, David. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Max. So hopefully you all understand why I was so delighted to have our colleagues from Durham be able to represent the important work that they've done. They took the model that we in Portland pioneered and tested, and then did a whole bunch of things that I think all of us have learned a little bit from and will be putting into practice here in Boston and hopefully elsewhere. And I'll talk about that in just a minute with a little bit of time I have left. I do want to talk a little bit about what we've learned and some challenges. And I don't think I have to spend too much time talking about this to any of you, which was that the COVID-19 outbreak really changed the way that we envisioned this project. We thought that it was all going to be in person, and we gained new skills, but it was challenging. You can imagine for Max's team having to work with a population that not all of them necessarily had reliable internet access or a place that they called their home. Made this challenging, and it was inspiring to see how the different teams did this work, working with different kinds of audiences. So the pivot was definitely hard. Another thing was that the long period of time that we did these co-creation periods over was challenging because of transitions of staff. I'll talk about that a little bit more, but it was challenging and took away from stability with all of the trust issues that Max and others have discussed today. And then the final thing is that the world changed. And so some of the things that were on top of people's minds when topics were selected changed. There was a pandemic. People worried about that. In the world, there was all of the social justice concerns about racial inequity and the murder of George Floyd, which happened around the same time. And so people may have had other priorities on their mind. But we did learn quite a bit from this project. And one of the things that we learned was that just because everyone has a spot at the table doesn't mean that everybody should necessarily be charged with doing the same amount of work. We originally envisioned that each partner or each kind of institution would carry equal weight throughout the project and make all the decisions along the way together. But that's not really how it passed, how it worked out. As it turned out, it was almost more like people were passing the baton based on their capacity, their individual expectations, and their competing priorities. And so, the one thing we learned was that the role of different partners was very important to think a little bit about, so that everyone could participate in a way that was most natural to their needs and their capacities. The other thing that we really learned was that this policy forming step that we wrote in that was supposed to be a culminating completion of the model was challenging. The public facing events all took different forms. And in some cases, the product that came out of it was really not something that could be easily transitioned to a next action step. We think that we are learning a little bit more about that, but in some ways, the process of co-creation may have been the most important product. And one of the other things I want to say was this point about making sure that people understand their roles in the project from the very outset. So here are a couple of quotes about different reasons that people were involved in a project like this. And it's important to keep in mind that community partners have a lot on their plate. So we want to make it as easy as possible for them to participate, particularly when something like a global pandemic is happening. I'm almost done. I do want to say that we learned a little bit about this idea of the audience as experts, asking public participation to serve as experts and tapping on the knowledge that they have in co-creation projects doesn't always seem right to them. Even though the whole idea is to tap into the knowledge that they have, what we found is that some publics felt that they really, they were excited to be invited, but they didn't necessarily feel like they had knowledge to share. And it was important to figure out a way to bring that forward and clarify that so that we could have them see themselves as valuable and important. And that's something we're still figuring out. Very quickly, I do want to talk about next steps. So one of them is that we're expanding the model. So these are 9 sites. I apologize, this probably doesn't show good on that screen, but these are 9 sites that we've selected who will participate in the next round. We're providing pretty large stipends to each of these sites to go through an accelerated version of our co-creation process. And we have extended the model to co-created citizen science, or a process we call Science to Civics. Max Institution has been part of this too. We had a grant from the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration around the same time that allowed us to apply this idea of collaborative agenda setting, decision making, and policy forming across climate resilience, and having people collect data, learn about vulnerabilities through visualization of that data, and then get together to deliberate on what to do about these issues in a way that connects to it. We just had a paper published in Citizen Science Theory and Practice that describes all about that. But here are the sites that participated in that work. You can see them classified by hazard, and both Max's institution and ours participated in multiple ways across hazards. If you want to learn more about that, here's a website that you can go to where you can see each of the mini portals that these institutions participated in their own fashion. So I know that was a lot, but hopefully you understand the resonance and the great deal of interaction between the learning of the Transform project and all the important work that you're doing and what we've been doing on our side of the ocean. We look forward to collaborating with you, and thank you for your time. I'll stop there. If you have questions, I know you're probably behind on time, so I'll be quiet.
Thanks a lot, David, for your presentation, also to squeeze everything, this huge effort in just 20 minutes. Thanks also to your colleague, Max. Yeah, we know that there are so many details, so many interesting points also for the practitioners to be learned from you, and we hope to hear from you in the future also about the next steps of the CC-PES and this extension on other topics that you presented. I don't know if there are questions or comments to David and his colleague Max. I think it was really interesting also to hear about the learning process and how the process was so important, almost more than the products, the final products. In this journey, and also in Transform was the same, of course, changing all the plans because of the pandemics, but also because of many difficulties, the turnover of the people in the regions, any other challenges coming up for different reasons when you work together with many communities, many different organizations, public policymakers, research community, innovators, citizens and civil society organizations. Always some problem comes up and you have to deal with these. And this means, of course, changing your plan, but also learning from that. And yeah, I think that the takeaway that we can have from this project that we cannot think about a recipe for a good public engagement activity in which you have your ingredients and you can use this recipe in all the contexts, but you really need to adapt your idea, your general idea of public engagement process to adapt to the situation, especially when you talk about research and innovation. I think also what Max presented about what is science, how when we talk about science engagement, how it relates about public policy, when we talk about housing, when we talk about energy transition, what is the element, what is the point in which science and technology and innovation really come in and can be discussed together with the community, with citizens, with society, and what is the space to do something in terms of policy making and suggesting recommendation for policy making. So was really, really interesting once again for your contribution today for the final conference on Transform project. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for having us. Sorry we couldn't be there.
So now it's time for the last session of today, and as I mentioned at the very beginning of this day, one of the pillars of Transform was the monitoring and evaluation part. This is something in common with all the territorial RRI projects, but in general of all the projects that decided to embark on RRI. So how to evaluate the impact of the activities that you are trying to run and implement. So also in the case of Transform, as I mentioned, the monitoring and evaluation was key. We had an entire work package devoted to this, and University of Bergen was our fantastic partner to deal with this tricky problem, this tricky issue. And today, Roger Strand will have a sparring partner, a fantastic sparring partner, Giulia Bubbolini. She is part of our advisory board. Giulia is from a special agency in the Chamber of Commerce in Romania devoted to innovation and responsibility, so she knows quite well what means on the ground responsible innovation, working together with so many research and innovation stakeholders. She also led several projects, European projects on responsible innovation, so definitely she has a lot of experience also in how evaluate, how to monitor territorial RRI, the grounding of RRI in territories. So please, Roger and Giulia, our special speakers, to end up our day.
Is this on? Can you hear me? Okay, good. So since we would be sitting on a throne, Roger suggested that we would look regal. And since we're very simple people, our take on regal was wear something gold and shiny. Anyhow, also, like the Gen X I'm all pro-digital, but then when I have to think straight, I need to have a pen and a piece of paper in my hand. So you'll see me scrabbling when Roger talks. I hope you won't mind that. Anyway, thank you, Angela, for the introduction. Indeed, I have been coordinating a few projects dealing with embedding RRI in local innovation support, and especially I'm making reference to Marie, the latest of them. It aimed at building capacity to embed RRI in smart specialization strategies. So compared to Transform, we did not have the same kind of pressure to come up with something robust and scientifically developed in terms of measuring impact. But indeed, after 5 years of working together with our partners and each of them finding their own way to embed RRI, just like it happened in Transform, you had 3 different clusters, and each one of them had their own translation, as you mentioned in the deliverables, of RRI into their own agenda. So with this diversity, we really struggle to measure whether we actually managed to change something. And so we looked at the RRI indicators, and we basically couldn't get our head around them. We also asked for help from the big boys. We worked with the OECD to assess whether we were able to embed RRI in our smart specialization strategies to a point where they could turn or start turning into SS4. In the end, what we came up with were guidelines, not a set of indicators. So I think I can relate to the kind of work that you've been doing in Transform, but I would really like to hear a bit more about this, evaluative inquiry and this measuring the hidden work, even more than the outcomes and the outputs. Just like our friends from the US said just now, the process ended up by being more important than the product. So just if you could tell us about what happened in Transform, what kind of thinking you developed there.
Thank you very much, Giulia. I think when we talk about these things, it's very useful, as you did, to sort of ground it in the context where you work, right? So I think throughout this day, just to start there, throughout this day, we have heard presentations from individual regions, and they all present their narrative about what was the local impact, right? And in a way, that is the story that is important there, I think. So, what was the impact of the waste game in Muyetal Valles? What was the impact of the participatory actions that were being made in Lombardy, et cetera, et cetera? So, and of course, these are, as you say, these are apples and pears. There's just no metric that could be used to measure these. This is not a toothpaste factory, right? It's so contextual, so individual. And as you say, I mean, there is no scarcity of ROI indicators. And I've been sort of guilty of producing a few of them myself. That what is common for ROI indicators in the literature is that they are almost not used, right? You have whole books proposing indicators as a sort of outcome of a project, but they are not really deployed afterwards. And the reason is very simple. When you start a new project and you look at them, you see they're totally useless for your context. So in a way, we have at the very basic level, we have the individual narrative, which is we did this and we think that it led to that. And that is an outcome in a way, and then there is this administrative hope that you could assess impact, which is something that by definition happens after project lifetime, and yet you are asked to produce it during project lifetime. And after the project, there is no money to measure the impact, so it's forgotten, and anyway, the policy cycle kind of spirals on, and there is a new concept to be evaluated in 5 years, so nobody bothers anymore. So I mean, this is part of why it is like it is. But then to your question, so what did we do and what did we try to do? First of all, of course, we learned a lot from Maria as well. I mean, your project is one of the few where there's actually something that was done that was coherent. Right? The next thing is that SWOS 14 funded a lot of projects. It would have been nice if somebody was left in Brussels to coordinate a kind of joint meeting with all the lessons from the SWOS 14 projects. Perhaps they have other priorities at the moment, I don't know, but it would be very nice to see this. I guess there are hundreds of civil functionaries in the Commission watching this right now, and I would really like to propose that. Now, all of the projects had the same problems, I would say. So actually, there was an ongoing webinar series that lasted, I think the last one is now in December, for 1.5 years of just discussing the methodological problems of evaluating and monitoring between all of these projects. I think all of the projects developed their own solution, but it kind of started to converge, as you mentioned, on evaluative inquiry. Sort of a more, let's say, grounded approach, a more qualitative approach, more social science approach of doing interviews, talking to the people. We went around and trying to figure out, okay, so in the slides we see the steps that were taken. It's often presented as tools, and as tools that can be deployed. And of course you need that as well, right? What were the steps for the workshops, etc. But through these conversations, you get a chance to put into words other things like all the care, all the maintenance work. Sort of, why is it that, as was just mentioned, why is it a problem if there is a loss of staff? Why is a problem that the persons change if this is just a tool to be deployed? Well, it isn't just a tool to be deployed. It's about nurturing professional relationships over many years, and caring for these relationships and maintaining them and seeing what is possible to do here, what is possible to do there. And this, I think, is important also to tell back to Brussels. I think it is no surprise to them or to anybody, but it's perhaps there are ways to make calls for proposals or to think about policy developments where one takes this a little bit more into account, right? That it's not just about sort of reproducible tools to be deployed in any given setting, but that we actually say, well, all the work being done on making phone calls to make sure that the relationship is still active and all of that this is actually part of the work. This is something that one is paid for to do. Did I ramble now, or is this?
No, you were making total sense to me. Although I think a lot of has to do also with this overall elephant in the room, which is trust. I mean, when we're giving money to do something, they really want to see that we do that something, because otherwise, God forbids that they gave money to the wrong person, So from the administrative point of view, you are kind of forced to say up front what you will come up with, which is counterintuitive with this kind of projects, because you embark in a journey that needs to be innovative, because that is required by the call itself, and then you're stuck with a prophecy that needs to be fulfilled in the end, no matter what. So. And also something that we also reflected about in Marie is that you do your project, and then in the end you go like, oh, let's measure impact. As if impact was something that it's nice to have rather than the ultimate goal. So we're given public money because we need to bring some kind of change, and this kind of change will unfold after the work is done, after the last deliverable, which is part of the overall architecture, can really produce its effect. And also impact is about the future, right? And the future cannot be predicted or described in terms of indicators. It can only be envisioned, right? And so when you envision something, what you have is your own narrative of the future you would like to be part of. Really what the kind of thinking that we did with the OECD is really about this need to preserve the narrative element, and at the same time not to be too creative, so that those who give us money or the others that are interested in our work cannot have any elements on which to build upon. So I was thinking, do you think there's a way to envision the future, have a storytelling about this kind of future, and then kind of reverse engineer it into something that looks a bit more like a set of indicators, or at least a set of elements that we can somehow report on and about, so that we can also be transparent on the kind of work. Oh shit! Right, on the kind of work that we've been doing with public money.
Yeah, this is to the core. So it's about accountability and it's about trust. And the demand on accountability is also in part because there is no trust. Because if we trusted each other, we wouldn't have to have this audit culture. But at the same time, of course, accountability is good also for ourselves. So your question would be, could there be something nice to, you know, could one say something more general? We heard about 3 clusters and many more in the States, and yeah, but could we lift this up to the European level and say something? And in your own, I think in the context where you're we are regal, aren't we? Where you are the queen, which would be the move from S3 to S4+. I think you have many good suggestions yourself of how to do that within administrative culture. I think if we're talking about European projects then, like this one, sort of reporting back, we are just finalizing all the deliverables from this work package now. So what do we say? Okay, so we say we refuse to report back with the more indicators and all of this stuff, or we can say something, but it doesn't matter. Then, of course, there are these simple things that, you know, the pilots were carried out and they had this and that result, and they had this and that important result locally. And this is an important part of the story, and it was done by the correct methodology and all of this. But I think things like we just mentioned, like care, for instance. And then how you probably can't quantify care, but you can describe it though. You can describe that there are long-standing relationships. I mean, now we are in Milan. There's a long-standing relationship between the Fondazione Bassetti and other important actors in the Lombardian society. And this can be described. And I think it can be described as an enabling condition and as almost a success criterion for being able to do certain things. Whereas a foundation that didn't have that history and didn't have those relationships, knowing how to work within that ecosystem, couldn't do the same things. And that I think we also saw in the different clusters, that the presence or absence of long-standing relationships is an example of very important enabling conditions. This is actually something you can see even ex ante. But you can describe the maintenance work of nurturing it and developing it further. And if I may, I mean, I was looking at the call text for SWOFS 14. You know, accountability, I mean, another thing we could do is to insist accountability both ways. So this is the expected impact of the call, right? It's consortia are expected to elaborate and implement a more open, transparent, and democratic research and innovation system in their defined territories. I mean, not even grammatically, I know what this sentence means in a way. So we're saying that the Catalan cluster is supposed to implement an RNI system in Catalonia. But the project cannot do that. The project can interact with the system. And to quote one of our informants, you know, projects can't change policies. Projects can interact with policy development, but as a matter of fact, as was mentioned by Jeremy and the problem of representativity, a project can't just take over governmental decision-making. So if we could also use experiences like this to sort of insist on better expected impact descriptions in calls, and then we could be more honest in the communication back to them. They should not ask for a guarantee for success.
Yeah, indeed. Projects cannot change maybe politics, but people definitely do. So I think what one of the main results of projects like this is really the change in the mindset, or the nurturing and fostering of the relationship that pre-exists, but that can become more, can become stronger and wider and develop on a wider scale. And to this extent, I think that maybe Interreg projects are maybe slightly better in supporting this process because they're not about implementing anything. They're not about, as I said before, creating new knowledge. So they might seem weaker in a way, you know, that they don't build anything. But at the same time, they're so strongly focused on connecting people and building their capacity that are able to you know, really hinge on this element of the hidden work. That maybe you're not, you know, you're pressured to kind of generalize this kind of thinking, which we were not. And so there's a very nice quote in this paper that says that a tool is a tool, so as long as it makes sense in the specific context. So to that extent, we were you know, the program was more understanding to the fact that whatever we were building might make sense back home, but not everywhere else. So it could be looked at as a good practice rather than as a rule or as, you know, something that, you know, from tomorrow on will be carved in stone and become like a building block of the literature. So to that extent, I think Mr. Europe has been a bit fairer to us than it's been to you. I don't know if you feel that way.
Yeah, and it's probably also because the Europe is not one master either, right? So it's something about how weak or strong the policy was in the first place. So if the policy was weaker, the demands are stronger. This is just the way it is, unfortunately. But at its best, these European calls, they provide an opportunity to give people a breathing space and a space for experimentation. And I think, you know, the best thing we can do is to report back in all honesty, what did that experimentation lead to? And how could it inspire others? And how could it also sort of transform back? Not just transforming these regions, but how can the bigger European institutions they also need transformation. They also need institutional change. And how can they learn from these projects to, first of all, just change the discourse a little bit and talk about what's actually going on rather than fantasies, right?
Sure. I'm looking at Angela.
It's 2011, so we're...
All right, just 1 minute left.
Yes.
Okay, no, but we could go on and on and on forever, but I wouldn't want to leave the audience with the idea that, you know, everything is like, you know, still undefined. I've been reading the deliverables, and they're actually very, very dense. They're also, you know, they challenge the usual thinking around measuring impact and how to get away without getting away from not so much indicators, but the need to report somehow in a way that is understandable what kind of added value we generated. So I would really hate to think that you know, the exercise was left at a too philosophical level. So really, maybe I will leave the last words to you, but just let me thank the Transform Project for having me on their advisory board. It's been very interesting, and just so, you know, COVID really disrupted our chance to build stronger ties, but you know, I do hope that there will be chances to cooperate together, because it's been really a teachable time, the time that I spent with you. So thank you so much. And Roger, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Giulia. Thank you very much. And while many of the empirical activities are drawn to a close when it comes to Transform, we are actually in the most hectic weeks of the entire project, because we have a book contract which will be a full-size volume on innovation governance in the 3 regions of Brussels, Catalonia, and Lombardy. And we hope that will be open access available in the course of the next year. So then we will send you the links. But thank you very much.
Definitely. I will read that.
Thanks a lot, Roger and Giulia, for this really nice dialogue. And yeah, we are at the end of the day one of the final conference Transform. Thank you, everyone, for being here, for being online. Tomorrow we will have more inspiring example, and we will talk about the present and the future of Transform. Today we have talked about the past, what we have done so far, but we have a lot of plans for the future, for disseminating our activities and plans on how to integrate our experiences, hopefully in other interesting key initiatives about citizen engagement and stakeholder engagement in territorial policy. So thank you very much for the moment, and we will start at 9:30 tomorrow online and in person here in Milan. Goodbye.